There's a memory I can't put back down, a pencil-thin arrow scratched into damp limestone no bigger than my thumb pointing toward a seam of daylight that barely breathed. Dust hung in the beam of my headlamp like old snow. The rock felt cool against my palm, and for a long moment the whole cave seemed to listen, as if the walls were waiting for us to understand what the people who made that mark were trying to say. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I've lived most of my life inside the slow rhythms of these hills. Tucker County wears summer like a wet shirt. Mornings start in the high 60s and climb toward 85, the air thick with the scent of hemlock and wet stone. Even after I retired from the Park Service, I kept the habit of sunrise coffee on the porch, counting the seconds between a Veery's call and the freight train that whispers through Parsons around 6. If you've lived here long enough, you learn the shapes of the mountains and the moods of the river, the way fog lifts off the black water like breath from a sleeping animal. That summer of 2013 felt as ordinary as a worn doorknob, comfortable to the hand, familiar in all the ways that make a person think tomorrow will come looking exactly like today. Most mornings I'd walk the quarter-mile down to the mailbox, past the old split-rail fence, then cut over to the fire road where the gravel pops under your boots. The county was green to the bone that July, with ferns brushing your calves and spider silk strung low between alder branches. Folks around here measured time with small things, when the trout start rising in the cool pockets below the falls, when the blueberries burn sweet right off the stem, when the first pop-up storm throws a hiss across the lake in short needles and moves on. You'd see the same faces each week: Gene on his tractor, waving 2 fingers from the steering wheel; Cindy at the diner, slinging plates the size of hubcaps, and sometimes, if you got your timing right, one of the Kellis girls jogging the roadside with that steady stride nurses carry when a hallway stretches too long. Mara was the one I noticed most. She worked nights at the hospital in Elkins, but the hills kept her clock honest. On her days off, she'd run early 4 miles out and back, ponytailed damp with sweat by the time the sun cleared the ridge. She had a habit of tugging her earlobe when she listened to small tell that she was taking something in and fitting it where it belonged. When my daughter Paige introduced us years before Mara, "This is my dad. He's the one who can tell you where the good trails are," Mara stuck out a strong, warm hand and asked about the limestone cuts north of the falls, her eyes already smiling at the thought of disappearing underground. She liked the dark places, not in any dramatic way. She just liked the quiet that comes when the earth closes around you and your own breath is the only noise that matters. If Mara's spirit moved like water, Leora's moved like bedrock. She'd park a silver sedan by the ranger station, pop the trunk, and lay out topographic maps with a field scientist's neat patience. She and her husband Gideon were a good balance. She read the stone, he read the weather. Sometimes I'd catch them on their lunch break sharing a sandwich in the shade, the map weighted with a clean socket wrench so it wouldn't skate off the hood. She'd trace a fingertip along dashed contour lines and say things like, "If this seam is still open, it probably breathes on hot days." It felt less like planning an adventure and more like greeting an old house through a keyhole. Jordan Hale came into my life the way most carpenters do, through a door that needed truing and a laugh you could hear from the driveway. He wore sawdust like it was a birthright sticky to his forearms and knotted in his beard. He and Nella lived in a bungalow near the river where the porch light was always on by the time the sun thinned to copper. If I happened to run into him at the hardware store, he'd trap my hand in both of his and tell a story that ran long but never felt wasted, all while digging for the right box of 3-inch deck screws like a prospector who knew the vein had to be there. Then there was Tavish. He preferred Tav, who could take a whining belt off a pickup in under 3 minutes and have it singing again before your coffee cooled. He was the sort who kept a coil of rope in the bed of his truck because he believed in being prepared, and a man who believes that will always be invited when trouble wears work clothes. Sawyer rounded out the 5 Mr. Luth to his students. Saw to his friends, a teacher with a slow voice and a pocket notebook. He wrote in block letters squared like latticework. Kids who were too restless for equations would angle closer when he talked about these hills rock that used to be ocean floor water cutting patient letters through stone the way a cave carries summer like a secret. By the second week of July, the county had settled into its heat. The Bluebird Trail was busy on weekends. The Blackwater River ran amber over the rock shelves, and families crowded the cooler pockets with lawn chairs and coolers, the kind that clack when you pop them open. At the diner, folks shook salt over home fries and studied the forecast pinned by a magnet to the pie case 84 and humid chance of thunderstorms after 4. Out back, the kitchen door banged soft in the breeze, and the smell of bacon grease cut through the sweet of blackberry pies cooling on racks. I kept my routines. 3 mornings a week, I checked the volunteer radios at the station, toggled through channels out of habit, and signed my name across the log's narrow line. A lifetime in the woods teaches you that peace is real, but it's a fragile kind of real. People imagine the dramatic failures, the lightning strike in a pasture, a tree felled across the road, but it's usually smaller things that unravel a day: a loose boot, lace on wet shale, a wrong turn at a split you've walked a dozen times, a map corner torn off that you don't even miss until the light drops. The 5 of them weren't thrill seekers so much as careful people who liked hard rooms. I'd see them pair off at the trailhead like a good crew does. Leora and Mara bent over a folded map, Jordan bouncing a coil of line in his hands, Tav adjusting the strap on his helmet until it sat just so, Sawyer tucking his pencil behind his ear. They'd say hi as they passed, not to impress anyone, but because courtesy is still a language around here. The last time I saw them together before the season tipped, they were parked in a crooked row at the end of the lot, the hoods of their cars touched with dust. The heat had already started to waver off the asphalt in little glassy shivers. Gideon checked their permits with the quick friendliness of a man who knows these faces and trusts their judgment. I caught a snatch of their talk measured practical, like folks checking each other's knots before a climb. It pleased me more than I said out loud. When you've spent years underground, you learn to read caves the way some people read cloud lines. The entrances hide in plain sight gaps where cold air spills across your ankles, even at noon mats of moss that grip the rock a little too well, a sound like a long empty jug when the wind takes it right. There's a lesser-known fissure tucked into laurel thickets not far from where tourists line up for photographs at the falls. You wouldn't notice it unless someone showed you, and even then you might miss the narrow throat that drops into the hill like a swallowed breath. Word of places like that moves quietly past afternoon to evening between friends who can be trusted to bring a helmet and to leave nothing but a boot print that rain will take. That week, the county felt like a summer album. Evenings ran long. Porch fans knocked the heat into corners. People watered their tomatoes with a care that looked like prayer if you didn't know better. Erin Kellis, Murrah's kid sister, started a new shift at the diner and laughed at how the coffee pots weighed more than her forearms. Nella set a little plastic pool on her porch for their boy and dropped an army man into the water so he had company. Gideon came by the station for spare AA batteries and teased me about the fishing stories I'd tell when the leaves went red. If there were signs of a hinge coming loose in the doorframe of the month, they were quiet ones. I remember 3 small things. They stand out now because of what came afterward. First was the air that Thursday afternoon. The thermometer at the ranger station read 83 degrees F, but the breeze that slipped down the hollows felt cooler than it should have, like someone brave was breathing out from a shaded stairwell. Second was a list the group's plan written on a torn envelope, the kind people use to tally grocery totals: helmets, lines, spare lights. First aid roll Sawyer's notebook with a neat little square drawn beside each. The squares were all ticked off. Third was a promise I overheard in the casual way promises get made here, someone saying, "We'll be out by 8, the kind of line that floats over a parking lot and doesn't stick to anyone until later, when the clock drags it back and sets it down in your lap." That afternoon, I tuned the weather radio and heard Kansas thunderstorms doing their slow crawl on the other side of the map. Here, the sky stacked its clouds without much ambition, white on white heat, pressing from above and below. I fixed the screen door that wouldn't catch and set the screw so it would bite a little longer, the kind of fix that makes you feel competent where it doesn't matter much. People drove with windows down, sweat on their forearms, music low because summer here already has its own soundtrack river on rock insects winding up from the ditches, the slap of a wet towel over a porch rail. Closer to evening, I walked past the ranger station again and saw Gideon roll his shoulders, a move he does when his mind is counting. He wasn't worried. He was taking inventory the way a man will when other people's safety is one of the pillars he stands on. He flicked a glance toward the gravel spur where the less-traveled trail starts habit, not alarm. Inside the station, the wall clock ticked calmly, the second hand making its little half-sigh at the top of the minute. I jotted a note about a trail sign that needed paint and left the kind of message on a clipboard that's meant to be handled by someone else before week's end. After supper, I stepped back out onto the porch, and the county had that soft dark it gets in July when the light thins, but the air is still warm to the touch. Fireflies opened and closed like careful eyes over the yard. The road past my place runs straight for a stretch before it folds into the hills, and you can tell a lot by the way headlights move there, timid or confident, in company or alone. The river's voice deepened as night took it. There's a lower register it finds when no one's around to splash. It's an old habit of mine to let the last part of a day settle before I turn in. I sat quiet and listened to the county's small reports, a dog shaking its collar 3 houses over a screen door catching, and then easing shut, a distant truck downshifting once for the grade, and then disappearing. Off to the east, a porch light burned a little brighter than usual at the Vane's place, a rectangle of gold that touched the steps and stopped. It reminded me of a lighthouse on a clear night ceremonial more than necessary, but you keep it going because that's what you do. Around 8, I looked at the kitchen clock, not checking on anything, just taking stock of the hour the way a farmer does with rain. The phone stayed quiet on the wall, its red message light dark and patient. A summer moth threw itself once, twice against the porch lamp, and then found whatever it was after. Somewhere up the hill, a screen door opened and held there as if a hand waited on the knob for news to come walking up the road by itself. I left my own porch light on longer than usual. The night didn't ask for it. Habit did. Headlights stitched the road a mile below and went out. The river kept its low talk. Out there in the warm dark where the hills fold and keep their counsel, a quiet settled that wasn't the usual kind. I couldn't have told you what it meant then. I only know I stood there longer than made sense, watching for a set of lights that didn't appear, listening for a phone that didn't ring. That night passed in the way summer nights do here, soft at first, then oddly still, as though the air itself was waiting on something. The porch light at the Vane's house stayed on long after the rest of the street went dark. I remember standing in my kitchen around 9, looking out through the window over the sink. The ridge was black against the stars, the kind of black that swallows the last sound of a day. I thought about calling Gideon, asking if the crew had checked in, but I didn't. It wasn't unusual for them to run late. Caves can tangle time. A few hours underground feels like 20 minutes until you see the light again. By morning, the phone started ringing. First was Erin Kellis, Mara's sister. Her voice had that stretched sound that comes from trying to stay calm while your body already knows something's off. She said the group hadn't shown up at the trailhead and their cars were still there. I told her to stay put, that I'd head out and meet her. When I pulled into the gravel lot, I found her pacing beside a blue Subaru, arms crossed tight, phone clutched like a lifeline. Nella Hale sat in the back seat of another car, rocking her little boy, whispering something I couldn't hear. The morning was gray and cool mist curling over the ferns, and the sound of water moving under the rocks filled the silence between us. Gideon arrived a few minutes later, uniform shirt untucked, flashlight still clipped to his belt from the night before. His jaw was locked tight enough to make his cheek twitch. He'd already checked the ranger logs, no sign of the group leaving, no calls for assistance. Nothing but the permit they'd filed that morning. 5 names, 5 signatures, 1 cave. He nodded once to me, the kind of nod that means we're skipping small talk. "We'll take the first team in," he said quietly. "If it's nothing, I'll buy breakfast." The cave sat maybe half a mile from the lot, hidden by laurel and the kind of moss that drinks color from the sun. You could smell the cold before you saw it, a damp mineral scent like wet metal and riverstone. We rigged lines and switched on our headlamps. I remember the way the beams cut through the fog, pale and thin, finding the entrance where the rock bent into itself. The air that came out was cold enough to fog your glasses. We called their names first Mara Leora, and the echoes came back empty, brittle, the way sound does when it's bouncing off stone and nobody answers. Inside, the ground sloped down, quick packed dirt turning slick. The cave widened into a chamber about 15 feet across. Their first set of anchor points were still there, fresh rope dust on the ledge, no sign of panic or struggle. We kept moving, following chalk marks along the wall's standard caver shorthand, 2 lines for direction, circles for return. Everything looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. The kind of order you only get from people who know what they're doing. We found a single footprint in a patch of silt, probably Tavish's by the size. Beyond that, the passage narrowed until we had to crawl. After 40 minutes, we hit water. The stream that runs through the lower system was higher than usual, a steady hiss echoing up the tunnel. The light from my headlamp caught a floating leaf oak, brown, brittle proof that surface runoff had found its way in. Flooding after summer storms isn't rare here, but the timing rattled me. I radioed the team topside and told them to get more lights, more hands. By noon, we had 3 additional crews on sight ropes, staged and markers set. It had stopped being a late return. It was officially a search. Outside, the parking lot turned into a command post, maps spread across truck hoods, thermoses of coffee growing cold, a ranger scribbling times on a clipboard. Erin hovered near the perimeter tape, her hands balled into fists. Nella sat on the tailgate of her car, her son asleep in her lap. The boy's small fingers curled around her thumb. When the first rain came, it wasn't much, just a fine mist, but it made the leaves shine and the ground slick. That's the thing about these mountains. They don't roar their danger, they hum it. The following day brought helicopters. You could hear them miles before you saw them, blades chopping air over the valley search crews, calling into voids that swallowed every syllable. We mapped the cave system as far as records allowed, overlaying Leora's geological sketches that Gideon had at home. She'd traced routes that weren't officially charted extensions, guesses based on airflow and rock type. It told us 2 things: she knew what she was doing, and they'd likely gone deeper than anyone expected. We found the first piece of gear late that afternoon. A carabiner rusted from the moisture, wedged in a crevice about 100 feet from the secondary chamber. It could have been theirs, but we couldn't tell yet. The deeper we pushed, the more the cave turned against us. Ceilings dropping low enough to scrape helmets, the sound of dripping water ticking like a slow clock. Every now and then, we'd pause. Kill our lights, listen for anything. A shout, a tap, the faintest proof of life. But all that came back was the heartbeat of water moving through rock. By the 3rd day, exhaustion had carved lines into everyone's faces. Gideon refused to leave. Erin brought him sandwiches he didn't eat. I watched him trace his wife's name on the map corner with his thumb over and over, like maybe touch could fill the blank space. The official crews started to pull back after a week. The cave had no more to give, at least not to men carrying flashlights and hope. When the state declared the search suspended, we left the entrance taped and sealed a sign posted that said simply, "Hazard area. Do not enter." That should have been the end of it. But grief has its own gravity. The families didn't leave. Erin moved to a rental cabin near Davis, took shifts at the diner, kept her sister's photo on the register. Nella stayed in Parsons with her boy, a framed picture of Jordan in uniform boots on the mantel. Gideon retired early, though nobody called it that. He just stopped showing up. He'd drive past the trailhead, sometimes pull over, sit with the engine idling. You could tell he was counting something only he could see. Years rolled over us the way they do quietly without asking permission. Seasons changed, storms came and went, and the cave turned into a kind of ghost story whispered over beers at the lodge. Then in the spring of 2017, I got a call from a name I hadn't heard in a long while. It was Cale Drum, one of my old trainees from the search and rescue days. He sounded winded words clipped and tight. "Cal," he said, "we were in the Blackwater system, same ridge, different chute, and we found something. I met them at the ranger station an hour later." Cale stood beside two younger cavers, mud streaked across their faces, eyes too wide for how calm their voices tried to be. They laid it out on the desk, a carabiner orange paint flaking from the latch and a scrap of fabric still threaded through. The color was faded, but under the grime it looked like the same burnt orange the group had worn on that 2013 trip. I didn't say a word for a while. The room just breathed around us. Finally, I asked where exactly Cale pointed to the map taped to the wall to a narrow chute that branched east from the known path. "Maybe 60 feet beyond the last mapped chamber," he said. "There's a void back there. We didn't go far, didn't feel right." By dawn, we had a full team ready to re-enter. The caution tape came down the press, already circling like weather, and Hollis Crane, now the senior ranger, took charge. He hadn't aged well, but his eyes were still sharp. Same rules he told us. Go slow. Stay in line. Mark everything. When we descended, the air was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was nerves, maybe something else. The smell of wet limestone hit first, then that faint metallic bite of long still water. We reached the side chute within the hour. It was narrow, a squeeze that forced you onto your stomach helmet, scraping the ceiling. The ground beneath was soft layers of silt that had drifted in over the years. Cale pointed to where he'd found the carabiner, and we started clearing debris. My hand brushed against something solid, a crack of plastic. When I lifted it, my light caught the curve of a helmet orange and split along one side. A faint scrawl across the front read, "J. Hale." I remember going still. The others froze too, as if sound itself might shatter the moment. We laid it carefully in a bag and kept moving. A few feet farther, we found a notebook, the paper swollen and fragile, but the handwriting still clear. It was Sawyer's block letters pressed into the page. His last entry stopped mid-sentence, water rising fast, and nothing more. The words looked rushed, the pencil gouged deep like he was writing against time. We called it in. Within hours, forensics and hydrologists were on site cataloging every find. The evidence painted a grim picture, an underground flood triggered by a sudden storm, the cave's lower channels turning into a trap. No bodies, no clothing, just fragments. But every object felt like a voice speaking in the language of loss. Mara's buckle, Tavish's flashlight, Leora's sample tin, all found in the same chamber, all heavy with silt. When Erin arrived that evening, she stood near the entrance, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, staring into the darkness. She didn't cry at first. She just nodded when I told her what we'd found, her eyes fixed on the opening like she was waiting for someone to walk out. Nella came the next morning holding her boy's hand. He kept asking, "Is my dad down there?" And she said, "Not anymore, sweetheart. Not anymore." Gideon didn't speak at all. He just placed his hand on the cave wall and closed his eyes. By the third day, a crew clearing debris at the rear of the chamber hit something hollow, a sound that didn't belong. We brushed the silt away until a crevice appeared narrow and smooth, and inside, glinting faintly under the lights, was the buckle from Mara's harness. It was still attached to a shred of fabric, bright orange, turned rust. Forensics confirmed it within hours. I remember the air in that chamber growing colder after that, like the cave exhaled. Each day brought something new and awful, a flashlight with Tavish's initials, fragments of Leora's map sketches warped by water. Together they told a story we didn't want, but finally had to face. The flood had come fast, forcing them higher until the ceiling gave way. The cave had been their refuge, then their tomb. When we finally broke through another layer of rubble 10 days later, the lights fell on bones. 5 sets, tangled close, huddled like people who'd spent their last moments leaning into each other. I could feel the weight of it settle through the crew, the quiet that comes when answers hurt worse than questions. The scientists did their work. The families stood by as gently as they could. Aaron placed Mara's buckle on a pile of stones near the entrance. Nella whispered to her son about courage. Gideon planted a sapling by the sign, its leaves trembling in the half-wind. You'd think that would have been the end, that the cave would go still again, that the living could go back to their lives. But just as the last of the equipment was being packed, Cale called me over. "Cal," he said, voice low, "look at this." On the far wall of the chamber, under a thin film of mud, was a scratch, an arrow pointing deeper into rock. It was small, deliberate, made by a sharp edge. For a long minute, nobody spoke. Hollis stepped closer, ran his light along it, and said almost to himself, "Could be nothing." But his eyes said otherwise. That mark pulled at something in me. I couldn't name, a feeling that the story wasn't finished, that maybe in those final hours someone had tried to show the way out. We stood there listening to the cave breathe around us, that soft, endless drip of water falling from the ceiling into pools below. Outside the sun was setting, the forest turning gold through the entrance like a promise. But down there in that pocket of the earth, the light didn't reach far enough, and the silence pressed in like a question that hadn't been answered yet. For a long moment, none of us spoke. That faint arrow carved into the stone held the room like a held breath. The air felt heavier than before, the kind that fills your ears and dulls your heartbeat. Hollis turned his light down to half power and crouched beside the mark, brushing a gloved finger along its edge. The line was shallow but deliberate, cut clean, not the random scrape of a rock fall. "Could have been a tool," he murmured. I nodded, though we both knew what that meant. Someone down here had been alive after the collapse, alive long enough to leave a sign. The next hours passed in a quiet fever. Word spread up top, and by the time I climbed out for air, the parking lot looked like a small outpost, TV vans, families, volunteers holding thermoses of bad coffee. Erin stood apart from them, arms folded against her chest, staring into the trees. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. Her eyes found mine, and in that shared silence, I felt the weight of what we might uncover. Back inside the cave had changed. Once you know people died in a place, it hums differently. We set up fresh lines, brought in a small drilling unit, and started clearing debris near the wall with the arrow. The sound echoed down the passages, metal against stone, the slow grind of progress. Hours in a vibration changed pitch. The hydrologist, a young guy named Brennan, tapped the gauge on his sonar device. "There's a cavity behind this," he said. "A big one." That word "big" put a chill in my gut. When the last of the rubble gave way, a cold draft slipped through, a living breath from deeper in the earth. We widened the gap just enough for a man to slide through. Cale volunteered first. He was smaller than the rest of us, and he'd found the arrow. He clipped in, dropped to his stomach, and wormed into the darkness, the beam of his headlamp shrinking until it was just a pinprick. The radio crackled with static. Then his voice came hushed but clear. "You need to see this." The chamber opened into a low cavern, maybe 30 feet across. The air smelled of rust and mold, old water and ash. On the ground lay a scatter of objects, tin cans with the labels gone, a half-collapsed sleeping bag, and near the far wall a page pinned beneath a rock. The paper was swollen from moisture but still readable. I saw the handwriting before he said it aloud. Block letters clean and heavy. Trapped. Water gone. Heading down. July 17th. It was Sawyer's. I remember kneeling beside that note, my glove trembling slightly as I lifted the edge. 2 days after the collapse. They'd survived. The realization carried a strange ache like joy caught in the throat of grief. They hadn't died right away. They'd waited rationed, written, hoped. The flood must have sealed them off from the main chamber. Maybe they thought heading lower would lead them to an exit. It made sense until you pictured what lower meant in a cave that shifts with every storm. Dr. Foss examined the cans, her magnifier fogging from her breath. "Military rations," she said softly. "Old, but sealed. Someone was prepared. Tavish's doing, we guessed he had a knack for stockpiling gear." The team mapped every inch of the cavern. Drag marks cut through the silt, faint but clear. Something or someone had been moved. We followed them until they disappeared into another squeeze, this one tighter slick with calcite. Brennan sent the sonar again. "There's a drop ahead," he said. "A steep one." We debated the risk. The cave had taken enough lives, but leaving that tunnel unexplored would have meant letting those voices go unanswered. Cale went first again, rope at his waist. I followed a few minutes later, sliding on my stomach, feeling the rock close around my shoulders. The passage turned, dropped, then opened abruptly into a hollow space the size of a one-car garage. My headlamp swept across the floor and froze. 2 bodies, or what time had left of them, lay near the base of the wall. Bones, clothing, fragments, the dull flash of metal gear. Dr. Foss joined us, moving slow and deliberate. Her voice was calm, clinical. 2 individuals, she said. Likely male. Fractures consistent with fall trauma. The clothing confirmed what we already suspected Jordan and Tavish. They'd tried to climb out, maybe to clear a path for the others, and the collapse caught them. But what held me still wasn't the remains. It was what the light found above them, a narrow crack in the ceiling sunlight, faint as dust. The stone around it had been scratched raw like fingers clawing for purchase. They'd reached the surface, inches from open air, and never made it through. When we broke back topside, the families gathered at the tape line. Nobody needed to say who we'd found. It was written on our faces. Erin pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes unfocused. Nella asked only one question. Were they together? And when I nodded, she closed her eyes and said, "Good." Gideon stood behind her, still as a tree, a single tear catching in the corner of his beard. Over the next week, search teams spread through the woods above the site. If Jordan and Tavish had fallen near daylight, it meant the others might have found another way out. The ridge was a tangle of underbrush and slick rock, miles of steep ground with no clear path. We combed through every foot of it, finding little more than old beer cans and animal tracks until day 5, when one of the rangers called out. A scrap of fabric had caught on a branch near the east slope. Orange, faded almost to gray. It matched the same weave as the group's caving suits. Beneath it, pressed into the mud, was a partial footprint, smaller than the men's tread, still visible. The air around that find seemed to tighten. If Leora Mara or Sawyer had reached this far, they might have kept going. We expanded the search grid eastward, following the ridge until it broke into a narrow creek bed. The creek ran shallow that spring, no more than ankle deep, but its banks were lined with debris washed down from years of storms. That's where we found the first map fragment, a torn piece of waterproof paper with Leora's careful handwriting, the kind that curved slightly at the edges. Lines, arrows, and one word written twice east, the same direction as the arrow carved in the chamber. By then, news had spread beyond the county. Reporters camped at the access road asking if we believed anyone could have survived outside the cave for long. I told them the truth. I don't know. It wasn't false hope, it was a simple fact. People surprise you when the world goes dark. I'd seen folks walk out of blizzards after a week. I'd also seen others lose their way 200 yards from safety. We worked that creek for days. Every stone turned, every bend marked. On the third afternoon, just before sunset, Cale's boot struck metal. He reached down and pulled up a buckle tangled in roots stamped with Sawyer's initials. It was old, corroded, but there was no mistaking it. The pattern was becoming clearer. The three who remained had followed the water east toward the forest. That night, the forest held a kind of reverence. We lit lanterns instead of floodlights to keep from scaring wildlife. But it made the scene feel like something from another time, shadows moving slow between trees, voices low and respectful. Aaron sat near the fire, clutching the note we'd found in the lower chamber. He said, "Heading down," she whispered mostly to herself. He didn't mean down the cave. He meant downhill. It made a certain sense. Floodwater flows down, so would they. When daylight returned, we pushed farther along the creek until it curved toward a steep ravine. The dogs caught scent first, short, sharp barks followed by stillness. Beneath a rock ledge half buried in leaves was another discovery, a knife its blade dulled and rusted the initials SL barely visible near the hilt. The hydrologists mapped the ravine and determined that a secondary collapse had likely occurred years after the first flood. That meant any remains nearby could have been buried more recently and possibly protected from the worst of the elements. We marked the area for excavation. It took 2 full days to clear enough debris to reveal what lay beneath a tangle of human bone and torn fabric, orange and green, mixed in the dirt. The fractures, the placement, all signs of a fall. Dr. Foss confirmed what our hearts already knew, Mara, Leora, and Sawyer. They'd made it out of the cave, traveled miles through forest and creek, only to lose footing near the ridge and never get up again. The discovery brought an end to years of not knowing, but closure isn't as clean as people think. Erin knelt beside the edge of the ravine, whispering her sister's name like it might still echo back. Gideon laid his hand on Leora's jacket scrap and murmured something I couldn't catch. Nella stood with her son tucked against her hip, tears sliding silent down her face. The sound of wind through the trees filled the rest. As we packed up the last of the gear, Cale motioned for me to follow. We climbed the ridge above the ravine, pushing through brush until we reached a small clearing. There, caught on a stump, was another piece of Leora's map. This one with a final note scrawled in the corner, barely legible, "Help here." It fluttered when the wind rose, faint and stubborn, as if the forest itself hadn't yet finished its story. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, the light turned the trees to copper. I stood at the trailhead long after the others had gone, listening to the sound of water running through the valley. The cave had finally given back what it owed, but the land around it still felt restless, holding its last secrets close. Somewhere between the rock and the river, between hope and surrender, those 5 had left a trail that time couldn't quite erase, and part of me knew we hadn't seen the end of it yet. I can still see that map fragment in my mind, the one fluttering from the stump. The paper had gone soft from rain, the ink bled at the edges, but that shaky scrawl. "Help here" hit like a nail through the heart. Wind moved through the trees while we stood there, nobody saying much, just staring at that piece of paper that had survived 4 summers, 4 winters. Leora's handwriting, no doubt about it. It felt like she was still reaching out from the edge of time, asking us to look one more time just a little farther east. We called it in, and by evening the whole ridge came alive again. Lanterns burned like scattered stars, their light trembling on wet leaves. Hollis had the Forest Service draw up a new perimeter. Every line of sight, every drainage, every hollow got flagged. Erin refused to leave the site. She said she'd sleep in her truck if she had to. I didn't argue. Some things you don't try to reason out of people. You just stand next to them until the night starts to cool. At first light, we followed the trail beyond the clearing. The slope fell steeply into a valley, shaded and dense, a place the sun barely touched. The earth was soft from runoff, and the smell of it wet pine moss. Something almost sweet from decay clung to our clothes. Cale led the way, careful with his footing. Every few steps he'd kneel brush leaves aside, scan for anything that didn't belong. It was near noon when he stopped suddenly and held up a small metal whistle. The mouthpiece was choked with dirt initials, scratched faintly along the side, S.L. Sawyer Luth. I don't know what it is about small things, but they hit hardest. That whistle could have fit in my palm, yet it made the world feel enormous again, like we'd stepped into the space where their last sound had died. I imagined him using it 3 short bursts, the universal call for help, then waiting, hoping someone would answer. The forest must have swallowed the noise whole. We followed the ground disturbance another 1/4 mile until the terrain shifted into a shallow creek bed. Water ran thin but steady, cold enough to sting your skin. Dr. Foss crouched beside a rusted canteen, half buried near the bank, brushed away mud with her thumb. The initials on the cap, LV, stopped her hand mid-motion. "Leora's," she said quietly. The canteen smelled faintly of something herbal when she opened it. Foss raised it to her nose and said, "Marigold and willow bark. That's old field medicine." Mara again. Even at the end, she'd been tending to the hurt. That creek became our compass. We walked its length until the woods thinned into a clearing ringed by black birch and laurel. In the center sat a low fire pit, long gone cold. The ash was faintly gray, streaked with flecks of bone, small not human, probably game they'd cooked. Around it lay the remains of a camp, a charred log, a torn length of rope, fragments of a plastic tarp, and near the edge of it a crude splint fashioned from sticks and tape. Foss held it up and looked toward me. Someone here couldn't walk. I thought of the journal entry we'd found, the one about the water rising fast. Maybe a leg had broken then. Maybe they'd been carrying each other since. By dusk, we knew we were close to the end of their path. The dogs had gone quiet, that strange silence they find when scent thins to memory. We decided to push another mile before dark. The trail climbed sharply, then cutting across slick rock. My knees ached from the incline. At the top, where the ridge leveled out, a bark from one of the handlers snapped the air. When I caught up, I saw the hole first, a low mouth of stone hidden under vines no wider than a doorway. A small cave, shallow, probably formed by erosion from storms. Inside, the air was still and dry. I remember the sound of the camera shutters slowing, everyone realizing at once what we'd found. 3 skeletons rested against the back wall. Their arrangement wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, as if they'd been set there gently. One had a crude splint on its leg, another a torn band of orange fabric tied around the arm. The colors told us everything. Mara, Leora, and Sawyer. They'd made it farther than we'd dared imagine. Dr. Foss moved among them with the kind of care that comes from years of seeing this sort of thing but never getting used to it. "Fractures from a fall," she said quietly. "Malnutrition. Exposure. No sign of animal predation. No violence. Just exhaustion and time." It looked like they'd huddled together and waited for a sunrise that never came. Foss ran her hand over a section of the wall near them. "Look at this," she said. Etched faintly in the rock was another arrow, smaller than the one below ground, pointing upward toward the ridgeline. It took us a long time to leave that place. The families stood together in the clearing below when the remains came out, the gurneys wrapped in canvas, each marked with a single stone. Erin knelt and pressed her forehead to the earth. Gideon set a hand on her shoulder but didn't speak. Nella held her boy close, whispering that his father's friends were brave people. You could feel it, the mixture of grief and pride, love and finality. I've seen a lot of recoveries in my life, but that one carried something sacred. The following week blurred into logistics, transport, identification, press conferences, but my mind kept looping back to the path they'd taken 5 friends, a flood, a climb, then a crawl through wilderness. Each mark, they left a carved arrow a page. A buckle wasn't just a breadcrumb. It was a promise that they wouldn't disappear without a trace. And still, even after the last body was accounted for, the cave held on to its secrets like a living thing. A few days after we cleared the site, Cale asked if we could walk the hillside again. "There's something up there I can't stop thinking about," he said. We went back late in the afternoon, just the two of us. The sky hung low, the air damp with the smell of rain coming. At the ridge's crest, he pointed toward a patch of disturbed ground near the roots of a spruce tree. "That's where I found the map piece," he said. "But there's a line past it, like a path someone made." We brushed aside the debris, revealing a faint trail barely visible leading through the undergrowth. The path twisted until it opened into a smaller clearing where a tree stood, bark pale and scarred. On its trunk, carved deep and ragged, were 3 letters, M-L-S. I reached out, tracing them with my fingers. "You think they made it this far?" Cale asked quietly. I nodded. "Yeah. Maybe they stopped here before the storm hit." It was possible they'd used that tree as a signal, a final anchor to the living world. We documented it and turned back before dark. Hollis met us at the trailhead, still wearing that weather-beaten ranger coat that smelled like pine tar and smoke. "You find anything new?" he asked. I showed him the photo of the carving. He squinted at it for a long moment and said, "They never quit, did they?" I shook my head. "No," I said, "they didn't." That night, as the equipment trucks rolled out and the valley fell quiet again, I stayed behind. The cave mouth was dark now, sealed and guarded, but the air still held a faint coolness that spilled into the grass. I thought of Leora's note, of Sawyer's whistle, of the herbal scent in Mara's canteen. All of it pointed to one truth: they'd done everything right, every instinct that should have saved them. Nature just had its own rules. When dawn broke, the forest took on that pale light that makes everything look older. Erin approached with a small box, 5 stones from the creek, smooth and gray. She placed them one by one on the memorial at the trailhead. "For all of them," she said. Then she stepped back, wiped her hands on her jeans, and let out a long breath that seemed to carry 4 years of silence with it. Before we left, I glanced once more toward the ridge. The wind shifted, carrying a low whistle through the trees, just air, but for a heartbeat it sounded almost human. The kind of sound that makes you stop and listen, because you can't quite decide if it's memory or echo. I don't think any of us will ever know which it was. But that's how these stories stay alive, not in the noise they make, but in the quiet that follows when everyone else has gone home. The morning after Erin placed those 5 stones, the valley felt different. The forest was still there, unchanged on the surface, but something in the air had settled. For the first time in years, there wasn't the sound of engines or search dogs or men calling into the dark, just the soft hiss of the creek below and the sigh of wind through pine. I stood by the trailhead sign where their photos had once hung, the tape edges curled from rain, and I tried to imagine how quiet it must have been for them at the end. That kind of quiet stays with you. It changes how you listen to the world. Over the next few weeks, life began to pull itself back together in the small, uneven ways grief allows. The official reports came through identifications, confirmed timeline, established causes, documented in careful clinical language. The families met with the investigators one last time in a small conference room at the ranger station. Hollis, in his uniform, pressed but still a little rumpled at the collar, read through each finding with the patience of a man who's learned that truth and comfort don't always share the same space. Flood event, structural collapse, exposure. No sign of foul play, just the slow math of nature closing its hand. When it was over, Erin asked to speak. She didn't make a speech. She just said, "Thank you," voice thin but steady, and asked that the cave be closed for good. Hollis nodded. "It will be," he said. And he kept that promise. The mouth was sealed with reinforced steel and stone, and a small plaque was set beside it with 5 names carved cleanly into brass: Mara Kellis, Leora Vane, Jordan Hale, Tavish Reed, and Sawyer Luth. No dates, no scripture, just the names standing alone in the mountain air. That's how their families wanted it. Nella and her son moved east to be closer to her parents. She sent a photo once, a snapshot of the boy standing at a school science fair beside a model cave made of plaster and cardboard. He'd written a label in careful handwriting. Caves remember everything. I kept that picture pinned to the corkboard in my study for years. Gideon eventually returned to park work, though not at Blackwater. He transferred to a district farther south where the terrain was open, the ridges low, and the caves few. The last time we spoke, he told me he still kept Leora's field notebook on his desk. "I can't bring myself to file it away," he said. She was always halfway between the map and the world. Erin stayed local. She took over a small coffee shop near the highway, one of those places where hikers stop on their way to the falls. She kept a display near the counter, a simple corkboard with missing person flyers from other counties. She said if anyone had to learn what she did, they shouldn't do it alone. Sometimes she'd light a candle near the corner for travelers who didn't make it home. It wasn't about superstition. It was her way of giving light to the dark. Cale stayed on with search and rescue. You might think a discovery like that would push a man out of this work, but for him it seemed to deepen it. He told me once, "They led me out of that place, not the other way around." It was Cale who later helped found a small volunteer foundation in their honor-funding drone programs for cave and mountain rescue. They called it the Echo Initiative. The first operation under its name saved 2 stranded hikers in the Monongahela backcountry. When they brought them out frostbitten but alive, Erin said quietly, "That's 5, helping 5. As for me, I eased back into retirement, though that word never quite fit. You don't retire from the places that built you. Some nights I'd drive up to the overlook near the Ridge Park facing west and sit with the engine off. From there you can see the tree line where the last of their trail ran out. In early autumn the light turns gold there, thick and slow, the kind that makes every branch look suspended between seasons. I used to think about how much those 5 must have loved the land to trust it with their final breath. That kind of trust cuts both ways. The story didn't fade as quickly as I thought it would. Reporters came back when the memorial was unveiled, and for a few months it made the rounds in magazines and small-town papers, headlines about perseverance and friendship and the mystery of the wild. But then the news moved on, as it always does. The cave sealed the forest, reclaimed, the photos came down, and for a while it felt like everything was at peace. But grief has its own way of echoing. Every heavy rain that sent water roaring through the gullies, every flash flood warning that came across the radio, it all carried a shadow of their story. I remember one night, maybe 2 years later, I was sitting at my porch when the weather radio crackled to life. Flood advisory. I stepped outside and the air smelled of wet iron. The hills looked almost blue under lightning. I thought of them again, not the tragedy, but the courage. The way they marked arrows into stone, the way they rationed and climbed and still tried to help each other to the very end. That's what I try to keep with me. Not the loss, but the way they refused to vanish quietly. When the 10th anniversary came, Erin organized a small gathering by the memorial. No speeches, just families and a few of us who'd worked the search. Someone had brought photos from the early days, campfires, birthdays, trail hikes, all before the cave. Seeing their faces in daylight again, all that youth and certainty, it was like touching a life that had only paused mid-sentence. We shared food stories, and when the sun dropped low, we stood in silence. The mountains hummed with cicadas, a soft, steady sound that felt almost like breath. That night I walked the old access path one last time. It's overgrown now, the gravel long since taken by moss. I stopped at the bend where the creek first comes into view. The moonlight caught the water in silver streaks, and for a moment it almost looked like movement, the reflection of headlamps maybe, or the shimmer of helmets in the dark. It wasn't, of course. It was just the land remembering. The earth holds its own kind of memory, one that doesn't fade with words. People sometimes ask if I still believe in closure. I tell them I believe in continuing not closure. Closure feels too neat, too final for something that changes the shape of everyone it touches. You don't close a story like this. You live beside it. It becomes part of the landscape, like a ridgeline you learn to recognize by heart. Every so often, hikers still stop by the memorial. They run their hands over the names, take pictures, leave small things, stones, pine cones, a folded note or two. A few of those notes have found their way to Erin's shop. She keeps them in a jar by the register. Some are from strangers who say the story made them careful, some from families who lost someone in the woods and never got answers. And every now and then a letter arrives with no name, just the words, "I saw the arrow once. I won't forget." I don't know who writes them. Maybe someone who passed through before the cave was sealed. Maybe someone who just needed to say they'd seen proof of hope carved into the dark. But I keep copies of each letter tucked inside a notebook with my field notes from the case. It reminds me that remembrance doesn't always come from monuments. Sometimes it's carried quietly between people who were never there but still feel the weight of what was lost. When I think of those 5 now, it's never the cave I picture first. It's the sunlight on their helmets that morning they left, the way it flashed off the metal like sparks from a fire. They were laughing, passing gear alive in a way that made the world seem wide open. That's how I choose to remember them. Not in the dark, but in the light right before it. Years pass. The forest reclaims what it wants. The trails fade and the stone plaque gathers lichen that blurs the letters if you stand too far away. But up close the names are still sharp to the touch, the grooves catching water after rain. Sometimes I run my hand across them and think of the last line in Sawyer's notebook, the one that broke off mid-sentence. I used to wish I knew what he'd been trying to write. Now I think maybe he already finished it, just not in words. So that's where I'll leave this story, not with the storm or the flood or the silence after, but with that unfinished sentence and the people who carried it as far as they could. They never quit. They left a path in the dark so someone else might find their way through. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to leave a trace that says we were here and we kept going. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever stood somewhere quiet and felt the air hold a memory, let me know where you're listening from. Every voice helps keep their light alive.